Hi class, welcome back to Biomedical Ethics. Today we'll be talking about or continuing our discussion concerning how new biotechnological developments are impacting human reproduction. On Monday we talked about IVF and how this is changing the way that humans produce children. Today we'll be continuing our discussion of arts and we'll be looking at surrogacy. So in this first section, we'll just be going over a few key terms and shifting definitions of parenthood or parents that's necessary for discussing currency. I'll point you towards three particular case studies, and then we'll be looking at Purdy, Robertson, etc.'s positions concerning whether or not surrogacy is ethical or not ethical. So, as we talked about on Monday, assisted reproductive technology or ARTS is the technology used to achieve pregnancy utilizing procedures such as fertility medication, in vitro fertilization, and surrogacy. Now, as we discussed, 90% or roughly, approximately 90% of couples and individuals who are struggling with infertility tend to use fertility medications or surgery to achieve having a child. However, for the roughly 10% of the population, those aren't viable options. So they tend to either recommend in vitro fertilization, which is the uniting of a sperm and egg in a laboratory dish, and or surrogacy if in vitro does not indeed work in this situation. So today we'll be shifting our discussion from IVF and we'll be looking at surrogacy. Now, surrogacy. A surrogate is a woman who gestates a fetus for others, usually for a couple or another woman. Now, the woman typically provides the egg, or IVF procedures are utilized in that situation. And in that situation, if IVF is being utilized, it's typically the case that the woman will then gestate the child with the genetic material of the couple requesting surrogacy. Now, because of the development of IVF and the development of surrogacy over the last 30 plus years, since as we saw the late 70s going up into 2020, they're expanding or changing definitions of what it means to be a parent. So now we have sort of demarcated parenthood into three separate categories. There are the genetic parents, and these are your biological parents, those that provide the specific genetic material. There are the gestational parents, or the parents that carry the child to term. And then there are the social parents, or the parents who raise the child. And as we'll see from some of the case studies, rights and liberties, etc., such as who gains custody, who gets to make decisions concerning whether a pregnancy needs to be ended for medical reasons. All of these questions become more complicated when we expand the definition of parenthood. Does the gestational parent, for example, get to make decisions concerning whether or not the pregnancy should be terminated, as we'll see in one of the case studies? What about the genetic parents here, who may have contributed the genetic material but is not currently carrying the child to term, right? What about the social parents, the parents who will be adopting the child after the child is born? All of these questions arise as parenthood or definitions become more complicated or expanded. Now, I just want to go over a few legal and economic considerations concerning surrogacy to set the stage or form the foundation. Surrogacy contracts typically specify that all of the surrogate's prenatal duties will specify whether or not the surrogates can do a particular activity or not do a particular activity. So they specify the surrogate's duties, such as abstaining from drinking, smoking habits, etc. That will be included in the contract. The involvement of the intended parents during pregnancy, can they have a large amount of involvement in the pregnancy, go to doctors' visits, etc., or are they not invited into those spaces? So this also includes their presence or absence during birth, but it includes a wide range of other activities as well, or could. The permissibility of abortion in cases of health abnormalities. Say that 3 times fast. Right? So, what are or are not acceptable medical interventions, particular cases, and the money paid to the surrogate. So, in each of these clauses here, you can see that it would potentially limit autonomy. So, one of the big questions that arises, especially when we're talking about medical decision making, is whether or not the legal contracts violate biomedical ethics. Does this conflict with autonomy? And do these contracts conflict with the medical professional? Also, is the medical professional, are doctors beholden to said contracts? As we talked about, medical professionals have a professional ethic. There's also a bioethic, and then mixed with the professional ethic, and that's been developing for over 2,000 years. And professional ethics is a very strong component of being a medical practitioner. And so yes, the surrogate may have signed away these particular legal rights, but then does that mean that the medical professionals need to follow this as well? I apologize for the pop-ups. I just needed to shut down a program, although I thought it was shut down prior, but evidently it did not take. So we can discuss, some potential legal here and ethical conflicts. And remember that the legal sphere and the ethical sphere, while they might be connected in the fact that they highlight certain social ethics, they can often and are quite separate as well. Now, these financial arrangements cannot be seen as a transaction involving the buying and selling of a child, as that is patently illegal in the United States context. However, money paid to the surrogate is typically seen as compensation for time lost, effort, diminished job opportunities, et cetera, potential long-term health impacts, So they're not seen as payment for the child specifically, but as compensation for these other factors. Now, in the United States, compensation tends to run between $10,000 and $30,000 per surrogate. Other legal considerations include the fact that there are currently no national laws concerning surrogacy, and surrogacy laws vary from state to state. So currently, there are actually quite very few states that have legalized surrogacy. One of the large ones that has includes California. But state legislation typically runs from complete bans on surrogacy to allowing it. However, one of the big issues is that many of these contracts are seen as unenforceable, meaning that they could be seen as problematic as they undermine or could potentially be seen as undermining the rights and liberties of the surrogate. In addition, there's a slippery slope, or at least a problem concerning whether the transaction is indeed seen as compensation for time lost, effort, etc. Some states do not see it as such and see it more as a slippery slope into transactions involving children, which is a very sensitive topic and a very unethical move, quite unethical, quite unjust. So different states fall on different sides of this issue. And again, it's another hot topic. Should surrogacy be allowed? Are the legal contracts enforceable? Are they not? Are they problematic reductions of the mother's or the gestational mother's liberty? What happens legally if there are conflicts between the gestational parents and the genetic parents? So all of this is new territory in the legal sphere and in the ethical sphere, as it brings up questions concerning whether autonomy is being negatively impacted here, whether these contracts should be followed by medical professionals, you will see in the legal sphere, at least with some of the case studies, how lawyers are arguing that the doctors should follow the recommendations of the gestational parents because the surrogate has signed away essentially their autonomy. But is this acceptable? All these questions arise when we talk about surrogacy and the shifting of parenthood. Okay, so I think I will show you at least two of these case studies because I want us to have them sort of in the background as we discuss the ethical concerns over surrogacy. And I think these highlight some of the questions that arise from a bioethics perspective, especially concerning autonomy. Let's see.
One of the unborn babies. The New York Post reports that Brittany Rose Torres agreed to be a surrogate for a couple's 2 fertilized embryos, but then one of those embryos split, resulting in triplets, twin boys and a girl. Torres says the parents are now asking her to abort the female fetus over health concerns, and she is refusing. She is now 17 weeks into her pregnancy in California. CBS News legal expert Ricky Kleeman joins us at the table to discuss. I think this is really tough because the babies are not hers, Ricky, but it is her body. So what are the surrogate's legal rights here?
Well, what you're dealing with here is you have to remember this is commercial surrogacy. That is that you are going to be a surrogate for money. This is a business deal.
You're saying there's a contract.
And you know I'm going to say there's a contract. But not only is there a contract, there is a contract, and when you're dealing with California in particular, which is known as a surrogacy-friendly state, that they mandate that both sides must have legal representation that is separate. So each side should know what is going on. They also mandate that it's notarized. That's really to make people understand the formality, the seriousness of what they're signing. But what you have here is a terribly emotional issue, really emotional.
So at the heart of it, can the parents force the surrogate to have an abortion?
In essence, yes, but let me finish it. They cannot take her literally, or if someone go arrest her and bring her to a table to have an abortion. So physically, can they force her? No. But ultimately, psychologically and monetarily, they can. Because what happens under the contract is they can stop paying. This is a money deal. This is $30,000 for this young woman. And they could sue her for damages for raising a child.
Isn't there a provision about this in the contract?
Yes, there is. And that's where, in this case, it gets a little sticky. There's a provision in this contract, as in many contracts, that what you can do is for medical reasons.
Right.
That the intended parents can ask to abort. Now here, the parents say that doctors have told them that in the event of multiple births, like 3, that they didn't expect, that you could expect developmental disabilities. The surrogate says, look, my doctors say there's nothing wrong, but we don't know that ultimately there's nothing wrong.
And she's saying she would even adopt the unwanted fetus.
She does say that.
Bucking up the waters.
Well, what happens is you have a motion against business.
How's this going to turn out, do you think?
I think that if the surrogate mother, the surrogate carrier, excuse me, really wants to keep this child, she ought to get her lawyers to go into court and try and get an injunction. If that doesn't happen, you have a mess on your hands financially.
All right, Ricky Kleeman, thank you very much.
Okay, so in this particular case, the surrogate ended up carrying triplets, and the gestational parents argued that one of the fetuses should be removed to ensure that there are no developmental disabilities that potentially could occur. So some questions to discuss concerning this are the following. Should the intended parents be allowed to demand an abortion in this situation, right? Should a legal right trump autonomy here? Why or why not? What would you do in this situation if you were the physician? And also, which physician should we be consulting here? The physician who is attending to the gestational mother or the genetic parent's physician who potentially has no connection whatsoever with the specific mother? And is this an emotional issue or, as the person said, a business issue? And this brings about the legality of contracts and medical ethics. All of these questions arise when we're talking about surrogacy. So now what I'd like to do is I'd like to shift to some of the ethical considerations that are brought to the table when we discuss surrogacy. Let's see, pause. Okay, so there are three positions that are typically discussed concerning the ethical nature or component of surrogacy. There's the procreative rights position, there is the utilitarian position, and then there are questions concerning the commodification of children, which is part of the reason why I showed you that clip discussing this is a cash deal, this is payment has been made for services rendered, etc. Does that actually lead to the commodification of children? Or again, is this compensation for time lost for the parent? So Robertson argues that we should take a procreative liberty position. So she argues, hey, listen, we currently have many fundamental freedoms. But one of the basic fundamental freedoms that we have in the United States and beyond is the freedom to reproduce or not to reproduce. We control our decisions concerning having children or not having children. And this freedom equates to or can be considered a right to make reproductive choices without the interference of others. Now, I wish someone would tell my mother this, as she's still calling about putting in her 2 cents concerning reproductive choices, and I'm sure other people have other parents who are very much vested in this question. However, when it comes down to it, brass tacks, so to speak, in the United States, you yourself, individuals, have a right to make their reproductive choices without the interference of others. And Robertson argues, well, this forms a foundation for us to build on concerning surrogacy. All right. So, is surrogate mother exploitation or empowerment in this situation? Well, when we apply this right to reproductive freedom to the question of surrogacy, she argues that one could argue that we have a liberty not to reproduce, that we can abstain from sex, we can use contraception, we can refuse to address infertility issues, and in many states, we can potentially terminate a pregnancy, right? So we do have this liberty not to reproduce. But if we accept a liberty to not reproduce, then the opposite side of the coin should also be the case. Then we should also have the liberty to reproduce. And this includes, in addition to decisions concerning whether family planning decisions and decisions concerning whether or not you're going to have children, this includes access to assisted reproduction technologies, IVF, surrogacy, etc. And both the intended parents and the gestational parents are exercising their procreative or rights in this situation. Their right to have children, their right to reproduce. So Robertson wants to couch arts and IVF and surrogacy, etc., as part of our fundamental rights that we enjoy and exercise in the context of the United States. We have both this ability to not reproduce, and we have the ability then to reproduce if we so fit. Well, not only the ability, but the right. And remember here that rights language carries special force. When you say that something is a right, that entails that some other party has a duty to either ensure that the right is achieved or that the right is respected. Right? So Robertson has a very strong position here, or is making a very strong claim concerning art, concerning IVF and surrogacy, that all of these things are part and parcel of the fundamental rights that we exercise concerning reproduction. Now, there are several assumptions built into this particular view. First, that personhood doesn't begin at conception. For the second sub-argument here, because the liberty to not reproduce is built into this particular argument. And she's very much pulling from Mill's harm principle here, that we should be able to do whatever we want to do and follow our fundamental liberties as long as it doesn't harm another person. But in the cases of just questions concerning gestational, um, social, and surrogacy, and genetic parents, so we could question whether or not or how we're going to apply the harm principle. But Robertson very much sees pregnancy as something that falls within this realm where you're doing what you're doing, you're exercising your liberties, and you're free to do so as long as it doesn't impact another person. And thus, liberty for Robertson should only be limited to protect the harm of others. All right, so as we can see, Robertson very much takes a hardline position utilizing a rights-based framework. Now, Purdy wants to push back against utilizing such a strong rights-based position, and Purdy argues, well, we should apply consequentialism to the question of whether surrogate mother is exploitation or empowerment. She argues, well, if the benefits of surrogate mothering outweigh the costs, then it's morally permissible. So we need to weigh the burden and risks associated with pregnancy for the surrogate against just compensation, right? And if the benefits here more than adequately address this burden, then surrogate mother is empowerment, and it is not surrogate mothering is empowerment, and it is not exploitation. So again, it's apply the principle of utility, look at the benefits and harms, and if the benefits outweigh the harms, then it's acceptable. And Purdy wants us to specifically do this in the case of the mother. However, she does include a few caveats, or Purdy does include a few caveats. In the case of surrogacy, women should be compensated in a way that they find acceptable without the following, because Purdy sees these as highly problematic clauses that can be seen, or that Purdy would argue, are unethical. Being coerced or forced into an arrangement, being held accountable to immoral, quote unquote, contracts, here unethical contracts, or those that limit a woman's autonomy or subordinate their judgments to the will of another contracting party. So even though Purdy is pushing for a consequentialist position where we're weighing the benefits and harms, it's interesting that this bioethicist is using autonomy to bracket that. That yes, we should do that which brings about the greatest good for the mother. However, that doesn't mean that we get to violate, that we then say that contracts that violate her autonomy are ethical, because by limiting or violating a person's autonomy, Purdy is arguing that these are fundamentally immoral contracts. And that's a very strong position. And I'm curious what you guys think, because as we saw from the legal perspective in that snippet, contracts they're seen as legal and not ethical, right? But is that an acceptable demarcation here? Purdy would argue no, that contracts that limit the autonomy of the gestational mother are unethical. That legalize, so limit the autonomy or subordinate their judgments to the will of another contracting party. Legitimize inadequate pay is $10,000 to $30,000 compensation for bearing a child. Is that adequate or inadequate pay? What about less? What about more? What is adequate in this situation? Or reduce the compensation due to situations outside the control of the surrogate, such as when a child is born with health defects or dies in childbirth. If contracts, Purdy is arguing, are truly to compensate the time and effort put in by the gestational parent, then it would seem to go against this view if compensation is not provided if the child is lost, right? Is then that would intimate that these contracts aren't actually about time lost, but could potentially be seen as purchasing of the child. So is that the case? Is it not? Do you agree with Purdy here? Should we utilize consequentialism to weigh the ethicalness of these contracts? And if the burdens of the pregnancy are outweighed by the benefits, and these clauses are accepted so that it's not an immoral contract, then is it ethical? What are your thoughts here? And that last clause that brought up by Purdy, reduce compensation due to situations outside of the control of the surrogates, sort of point us towards the Anderson's position, or Anderson's commodity argument. Now, Anderson argues that it's a slippery slope here concerning surrogacy, whether surrogacy is empowerment or exploitation. Because if it is the case, say, that children are being produced via legal contract and it's a business deal, then we could argue that surrogacy is reducing both mothers, womb for rent, and babies to market commodities that are then traded and controlled by legal and business contracts and not by biomedical ethics. If we accept that wombs and children are commodities and that autonomy can be limited here. And for Anderson, this violates the Kantian ethics, and this violates the very core of principalism and biomedical ethics built on this idea that autonomy should be respected. We need to respect the choices of our patients. What happens when the choices of our patients are taken away, when their choice making is taken away from them? So remember, Kant argues that treat others as an end in themselves and not merely as a means to something else, including as a means to obtain a child, right? So for Anderson, surrogacy treats women as a means and thus violates the categorical imperative and undermines the intrinsic value argument that is at the heart of rights theory, that is at the heart of Mill's idea that we should be able to exercise our liberty until we impact others. And it brings back that burning question: is surrogacy about surrogacy contracts? Are they about compensating the mother for the gestational parent for time lost, or is this really about purchasing a womb or purchasing a child? And as you saw from the discussions, state by state, this is very much an active discussion, again, with people on many different sides. And Purdy would argue that, surrogacy is ethical within certain parameters. Robertson argues definitively that surrogacy is empowerment and that it's ethical. And Anderson's like, whoa, 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 whoa. We need to step back here. We need to push back on that a bit. So we have three separate positions here, arguing three separate things concerning the ethicalness of surrogacy. So Anderson continues her argument. She argues that surrogacy also trivializes the social aspects of labor, which focuses on increasing bonds between parent and child, because the creation of life then is sort of seen as a business deal, as sort of then a system of manufacturing. You're utilizing a woman's body in order to produce a child for another family. And Anderson finds this highly problematic and finds that, argues that then motherhood, etc., that human reproduction is moving into the business realm, into the manufacturing realm, and she finds that problematic. And it ignores the emotional aspects of giving birth, especially when you give up a child, etc., and all of the emotional turmoil and harm that could do. So here we can bring in the principle of non-maleficence. Is the harm acceptable? Is it, again, a violation of biomedical ethics? All right, so I'm going to leave you there. We have three positions. We have Robertson saying yes, surrogacy empowerment. We have Purdy saying yes, with caveats. The contract needs to, meet certain criteria in order to ensure that surrogacy is ethical. And we have Anderson, who's like, whoa, 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 surrogacy, we need to hit the brakes. This is highly problematic fundamentally. So I'm curious, and I very much want to know what you guys think. So hopefully you'll have an interesting discussion in the discussion forum. And so I'm looking forward to discussing this with you.